Good morning to our participants that are not in Poland, and good afternoon in Poland. My name is Justyna Szczulik. I'm Deputy Head of Research at the Polish Institute of International Affairs, and it is my enormous pleasure on behalf of our director, or the director of PISM, to welcome you to the debate on Venezuela in crisis and under United States mounting pressure. And before we start our discussion with our guests from the region and my colleague here at PISM, I would like to tell you why we decided to talk about Venezuela today. Maybe you are, you're a bit surprised why now in Poland we have a meeting about Venezuela, but because the United States actions in the Caribbean and the pressure on Nicolás Maduro's regime in Venezuela in recent months and weeks have kept the country in the world headlines, also in Poland. And we at PISM, because we are the public think tank that has been trying to cover the whole world, so we have been following what is going on in Venezuela, and we try to understand what is going on there. And the problem is, from our perspective, that when we are talking about the Venezuela and we see the headlines in the news, we have an impression that we are preparing for another war, that the region is on the brink of the war. Also for us, it is not very clear what's the goals and what's the policy, Trump's policy on Venezuela. Of course, we know that he. We know that he has been talking about this. About fighting against the crime and including smuggling. But of course, we see some kind of threats. On the one hand, they are pretty serious. On the other hand, there are some, we think, empty threats. So for us, it's not very clear what is going on in Venezuela, and if we should expect a war in this region. And what is also very important, I think, and we should also pay our attention to, is not only the fact that there is a Maduro's regime, but also the fact that Venezuela is in a long, multidimensional crisis. Millions of Venezuelans have left the country. The regime has intensified its repression after, let's say, Maduro's victory, I will quote, victory in the presidential elections. And for now, it is very difficult to imagine the peaceful transfer of power. So this is the reason why we think that it is very timely, and we should talk about Venezuela and also to know the perception from the region. And today we have this opportunity to listen to a discussion that will help us to better understand the situation, but also in Venezuela, in this region, but also in the international context surrounding the country. Without further ado, I would like to pass the floor to Bartek Znojek, who is our expert on Latin America and who will be a moderator of the discussion. I'm very, very honored and grateful that experts from the region accepted our invitation to take part in our seminar. So as you see, there's a hybrid type of a seminar here in Poland at PISM, but also our guests online. So once again, thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and I will pass the floor to Bartek, who will be moderator of the discussion. Bartek, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Justyna. Welcome to our guests who are connecting online. Welcome our audience. I need to say that we are fortunate to have great expertise in this panel, and hope that our discussion will be fruitful. And let me start by introducing our speakers. First, Phil Branson, senior analyst for the Andes region at the International Crisis Group for the last decade, plus a few years as consultant for the group. He was before a correspondent for The Economist, and his current work is on political situation in Venezuela, the country in which he is based. Then we have Professor Mark Curtin, founder and director of the Center for International and Border Studies, a new think tank established last year in Guyana. He was a long-time lecturer at the University of Guyana, including position of the Dean of the Faculty of Social Science. He also worked and directed Institute of International Relations of the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine in Trinidad and Tobago. He authored books on the international relations in Latin America and the Caribbean, and from January 2019 to August 2020, he served as a special political advisor on international issues to President David Granger. Then we have Professor Victor Mijares, Assistant Professor of Political Science and Global Studies at the University of Andes in Bogotá, Colombia. He specializes in Latin America geopolitics, global security, and Venezuelan foreign policy with a focus on petrostates. He holds a PhD from the University in Hamburg. He is an associate to the German Institute for Global and Area Studies and was vice president of the Colombian Political Science Association. He is also the director of the Global Risks Analysis Program Geostrategos at the Faculty of Social Science at the University of Andes, where he leads interdisciplinary research and training on geopolitical risk and strategic decision-making. And finally, we have Stefania Kolarz, who is an analyst for the European Union law and Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Her interests include, in particular, external action, international agreements, and the system of legal protection of the European Union, as well as peace processes in which the OSCE is involved. She holds PhD in law. She is graduated in international and European business law from the University of Paris Dauphine, and in EU diplomacy and international relations from the College of Europe in Bruges. So that would be for our panelists. Just one reminder, we are not streaming live, but this event is recorded and we are planning to post it after that on our YouTube channel. And let me move to the plan for our discussion. This will be divided in 3 general rounds of questions, starting from the situation in Venezuela, then passing to a more broader topic of international context, and finally, trying to reflect on the potential scenarios for Venezuela and the region. This will be rather a conversation, interactive conversation, than a series of longer speeches. And importantly, there will be a chance for the audience to ask questions. I will also open the floor for you later and already encourage you to think about what you'd like to ask or comment. So, without further ado, let's zoom in Venezuela and start first round of the domestic dynamics in Venezuela and their regional impact. So we repetitively hear about a persistent multidimensional crisis that has been deepening for many years in Venezuela. Since the presidential election in July 2024, Chavismo has consolidated its rule with the increased repression among other means. And that would be my question to Phil Ganson, who is in Venezuela. What is your view on the current state? What is the phase of this crisis now?
It's a pleasure as well to participate in this panel with my distinguished colleagues. What is the face of the crisis now for ordinary Venezuelans? I think the first thing to understand is that, as you suggested in your introduction, that Venezuela has been in what the experts call a complex humanitarian emergency for about the past decade. And that, of course, is the reason why we've seen approximately 8 million of the roughly 30-some million Venezuelans leave the country, because simply there aren't paying jobs. There's the economy in Venezuela can't absorb the population. People can't put food on the table. And for those people who haven't been able to leave or who haven't wanted to leave, of course, the situation remains dire. We're talking about a country which has over 80%, because when I'm referring to statistics, it's important to realize that the government doesn't provide statistics virtually on anything. So the statistics we rely on are mostly from NGOs, from universities and so on. But roughly speaking, we're talking about a country with 80% of the population living in poverty, and according to some estimates, over 70% living in extreme poverty. And in real terms, what that means is, for example, if you're a public employee in Venezuela, you're very lucky to be earning as much as $100 a month, but it'll cost you 5 times that much to put food on the table for a family. Public services have not quite collapsed, but they're in an extremely dire state. Most people rely on the public health service, which is in extremely bad state. It's lost, according to some sources, around 80% of its capacity. If you go to a public hospital, you may be worse off inside the hospital than if you're at home. Electricity, water, internet, all the basic infrastructure of the country is in dire shape. But what that means really is that people are desperate for a solution. They're desperate to find any way out of this, and as soon as possible, obviously, and as painlessly as possible. And that's why, many Venezuelans support the idea of some form of foreign intervention, because everything else seems to have failed. Now I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Thank you very much, Phil, for this brief introduction, which links the long-term situation with the current context. And I would like to move a little bit to this, how this landscape affects the regional, the neighbors, which are Guyana and Colombia. Let me start with Colombia and Victor Mijares. Colombia is the country that received the largest part of the migrants who left Venezuela. There are also serious joint security challenges on the border. And these are only two of many conditions, topics that link both countries. While you research Venezuela, being based in Bogota, you are also a Venezuelan, so your perspective is also personal. And I'd like to ask you to add up to what Phil already said about your reflection. Plus, how do you see this important connection between what happens in Venezuela and what are the dynamics in Colombia to tackle these consequences?
Well, thank you, Bartek, and thank you to PISM for this invitation, for having me here with this great panel. I think that the main consequence of this situation in Venezuela is the continuous spillover of instability in the region. This instability takes different forms depending on the neighboring country. In the case of Colombia, this is particularly important. It often appears as the creation of a strategic rear base for criminal organizations such as FARC dissidents and the ELN, for instance. These groups use Venezuelan territory for protection, logistics, training, and cross-border operations, as you know, drug trafficking, increasing violence and complicating Colombia's internal security environment. As you know, the current situation in Colombia is pretty critical, considering that Gustavo Petro's, the President Petro's total peace plan is not working as he promised. So the situation right now is difficult due to the internal conditions of Colombia, but also because Colombia and Venezuela share more than 2,000 kilometers in a border that nobody controls, actually. I can say something about the situation of Guyana also, but I think this is a question for the next panelist. So I will say that, at the same time that this situation is happening in Venezuela, so Venezuela is also exporting the instability across Latin America through criminal network and political influence. This includes the movements, illicit groups, support of radical political candidates, and the spread of actors linked to Venezuelan state and non-state structures. So the combined effect of those is a broader regional environment that becomes more fragile, less predictable, and more exposed to the dynamics of Venezuela's internal crisis. And I think that we have now facing the probable cost of any kind of intervention from the United States, but we also have to evaluate the costs of doing nothing in the situation of Venezuela, because Venezuela is already exporting instability. So I think this is a major problem, and a huge security dilemma for the Western Hemisphere.
Thank you, Victor, for these words. And I think that the Guyana you mentioned is something that also is important part of this this linkage, because in 3 days we'll have 2 years since the referendum in Venezuela, where Maduro regime asked Venezuelans about including Essequibo region in the maps of Venezuela. There were some decisions which basically legitimized this change by creating position of governor of the state of Guayana Essequibo. There were elections, regional elections, electing that governor. So despite with that situation was especially important from the perspective of Guyana. So I'd like to ask Professor Curtin, how do you see those dynamics in last 2 years for Guyana, especially in the context of Venezuela's territorial claims and similar threats, similar insinuations from Maduro regarding using the force against Guyana?
Well, thank you very much. And I must say that I appreciate the kind invitation of the Polish Institute of International Affairs and the opportunity to join my distinguished colleagues in this event. I think that when one looks at the Guyana-Venezuela issue, it has to be seen as a multidimensional issue in a sense. And because historically, since the 1960s, Guyana has been, threatened with aggression, significant levels of aggression, when Venezuela developed a rather curious claim to the 2/3 of Guyana's territory and deemed the 1899 arbitral award, which had a full, final, and perfect agreement, as null and void. So we've seen acts of aggression by Venezuela across decades, including the seizure of the Guyana part of Antopo Island, which was part of the 1899 arbitral award. And since then, we have seen, especially in the region close to Venezuelan borders, or the borders with Guyana and Venezuela, acts of aggression, including movement by the sindicatos, which are Venezuelan armed groups terrorizing the miners over in Guyanese territory, and Guyana's inability to effectively monitor its porous borders, and therefore an effort to ensure that diplomatic effort be seen as the most important conduit to that effort, because as you know, for Guyana, diplomacy has to be its first line of defense because of the very small army and military capability and all other types of military assets. But then you've asked directly about the elections of a governor, and that brings another element to the concern about in Guyana, especially since that region has never ever been occupied or been part of Venezuelan territory. And here you have a governor being elected without any participation of anyone, any Guyanese. And this arbitrary decision to make Guyana Essequibo its Venezuelan 24th state is an act that has brought about some international concern also. Additionally, as you may be aware, the issue of the border controversy is at the level of the International Court of Justice. And Guyana, has continually participated in this effort, even though Venezuela on 7 occasions has argued that the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, has no jurisdiction in this issue, which contravenes all of the conventions of the United Nations. So here we have security concern, an issue of international law as another concern, the movement of irregular migrants as another concern for Guyana. As you know, officially, more than 100,000 irregular migrants are in Guyana and have really burdened the state with its, all of its humanitarian elements, including access to education, to welfare, to health, etc. And so this is why I term it a multi-dimensional issue, which we can discuss in relation to the current Venezuela-US crisis.
Thank you very much, Professor Curtin, for these comments about Guyana, about long-term historical issues. I go back on Guyana to Victor Mijares, but let me now move to Stefania for first reflections. While you are not an expert on Latin America, you follow the EU approach to different authoritarian regimes. So what is your lessons? How do you see what kind of common approach that you would link to the problem of Venezuela? Because the European Union was really engaged in that country to promote the redemocratization.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for organizing such an interesting event. Well, it's true that I'm not a specialist on the region. I'm analyzing the situation in South Caucasus and closer neighborhood to the EU. And from my observations, what we have in common is that the EU external action is based on values that remain unchanged, and also the toolbox is also flexible, but still we have some tools that do not really change from country to country. What changes, it's more the intensity of using some tools and instruments and political will. So while EU always promotes international law and protection of human rights, as well as peace, democracy, rule of law, and those values remain unchanged no matter of the part of the globe, there are some factors that would increase or decrease the intensity of EU involvement. And those are first and foremost the current situation of the EU, because as much as it tries to be a global actor and be everywhere and show its support and engagement all over the world, it simply cannot be everywhere. So what would be the priorities? Definitely what's going on closer to its borders, especially the conflict, the war in Ukraine. So it pushes the other regions that are more remote further on EU's agenda. Then, apart from the current situation, we have also this dimension of distance. So the EU external action is about concentric circles. So the most intensive actions are around its neighborhood, and then the further we go, the intensity is lower. And last but not least, it's an external action of 27 member states and EU institutions. So you see very different interests, knowledge of the region, or all other regions, different history, different traditions, different consciousness and knowledge of what's going on. So it also applies to the institutions, to heads of the institutions, that from time to time we will see more intensity, for example, in case of Latin America or Africa or eastern neighborhood of the EU, depending on who is in charge of external action. Yet, what's driving the EU in particular context of Venezuela is mostly about political principles, and it's repeated in multiple times in different statements, where it highlights the peaceful transition, peaceful settlement of the disputes, respect for democracy, human rights, rule of law. Last month also elections transparency, so it's about demonstrating the true results of the elections. It also appears in the statement. So in this way, the EU is very consistent and constant in its engagement. But also the toolbox includes something more, such sanctions, some more diplomatic pressure, some indirect actions such humanitarian assistance, or maybe not particularly in the case of this region, but also development assistance. But I believe that we'll skip to this topic and develop it a little bit later. So maybe I will stop here.
Thank you, Stefania. I would like to go back to Phil just before passing to the round about international context, because I think it's interesting. What is the mood now in Venezuela? How do you see that in this tense context? Because what we saw in reaction to subsequent decisions or declarations from the Trump administration, there was also response from Maduro on mobilization of Venezuelans. But particularly, I'm interested how much this situation helped to run the flag, the Venezuelans, despite very low popularity that was confirmed by the results of the presidential elections last year.
Yes, it's very difficult to talk about general mood. I think there are varying reactions. Of course, there's still although Maduro is in a big authority in terms of his popularity with the public, at the same time, there are several million people who, appear to be, continuing to support the government. And on their part, there's certainly a good deal of nervousness as it happened, not only because, of course, the US is threatening form of reaction, but also because if there were regime change, then people who work in the public sector, in government jobs, fear for their jobs. They fear what's left of the welfare system that they enjoy, and also they may fear revenge attacks. If there is a change of government, a lot of pent up anger, frustration, hatred, even on the part of people who've been on the losing side for the last quarter of a century. I think if there were to be some form of power with chaos following any form of US intervention, then there could well be considerable violence, and a lot of that violence would undoubtedly be directed at people who are perceived as being part of the repressive system that has been exploiting them, if you like, for the last 25, 26 years. But of course, there are a lot of people, as I said before, who really want to see change and who may be prepared to accept a certain level of suffering, even in the short term, if it means an end to the current government. Overall, I think people are somewhat frustrated and tired of the situation. I mean, the latest situation, obviously, the situation we've been enduring for at least the past 10 or 12 years, where the economy has collapsed by 75 or 80%. But they're frustrated as well because the US is appearing to want to do something, but it doesn't get around to doing it. They've been killing people on the high seas in the Southern Caribbean, but although Trump has been promising or threatening ground strikes for about the last 6 weeks, that hasn't materialized. So some people just want the fleet to go away. Some people would like the US to handle its threats. And then there's overall, I think this is a population as well which is very short on analysis or certainly high quality news and analysis. The government dominates the mass media. It blocks a lot of when which people might otherwise be able to get independent news and analysis. And so a lot of people really don't know what's going on. And even those of us who are supposed to see it and supposed to be more in the know, we don't really know, what exactly is going to happen, whether Trump will wake up tomorrow and decide to send over some Tomahawk missiles or whether he's going to order the fleet to sail away. It all depends really on the reactions and the feelings of one man. So it's been going on too long. It's been going on for 3.5 months, and I think people, especially with Chris, people want to see some form of resolution.
Okay, one more question, because I would like to pass to our second part of topics in international context. What I think is really valid is to ask about the support, international support Maduro is seeking for, because there were some news about asking Russia or Iran for some additional military equipment. But how do you see this? This mean for the regime as one that could help it to survive or to cope with the situation? What is your view on this strategic cooperation for the regime, for this strategic international cooperation?
That we've already mentioned in Brazil are headed.
We have some connection problems. If I could ask you to start again your response, because we barely hear what you've been saying. Okay, so maybe let's wait for a while. That's as the connection reestablishes. I would like to go now to Professor Carton, because we're talking about the international context. And I think that this situation we have is really important when we look at the importance of the Caribbean, security of the Caribbean, the positions of individual countries. We have Trinidad and Tobago that is clearly singling out with its pro-United States stance support for the actions of the administration. And we have a recent change in St. Vincent and Grenadine with the end of the Ralph Gonsalves government. So there are some interesting dynamics. And we have Guyana, which has this maritime security only as a priority in the security policy, because it's important for Guyana to have safety of these oil installations. That is an important base for Guyana development. How you see the context, international context of the U.S.-Venezuela tensions from the Caribbean point of view, and Guyana as the place which is important with CARICOM seat?
In the first place, when one looks at the Caribbean community, CARICOM, there seems to be a level of fragmentation in relation to the positions that individual states are taking. As you mentioned, Trinidad and Tobago has openly supported the US position and has actually indicated that the Caribbean is not a zone of peace, contrary to the decisions made at the level of the Caribbean community CARICOM, that the region must remain a region free from military and other intervention, and one geared towards peace, stability, and security. One must also recognize that indeed the Caribbean community has looked at the question of drug trafficking as a significant issue, which demands some form of intervention, but intervention based on collaboration rather than unilateral approaches. And so that brings with it, I think, another level of fragmentation. You know, the Caribbean is a transit state, a transit set of countries, the Caribbean Sea, for illicit drugs moving across the region. And the Caribbean is concerned about that. But the unilateral approach is bringing the differences among the states. We've seen where at the recent Community of Latin American and Caribbean States meetings, CELAC, all the countries of the Caribbean supported the maintenance of the region as a zone of peace, except Trinidad and Tobago, which brings, into serious considerations that have to be made in relation to bringing back that unified approach to Caribbean security. In relation to Guyana, one has seen where over the last year Guyana has been subjected to not only the movement of troops closer to our borders, but Venezuelan naval vessels going closer and threatening the FPSOs, the floating production and storage vessels, which are in Guyana's territory, Guyana's economic zone, exclusive economic zone, run by and the production is run by a consortium of countries of companies led by Exxon. So what we've seen is increased pressure, and indeed the concern is raised about our maritime security, in addition to concerns about movement of troops across our land borders, so that it brings in greater concern among the Caribbean and the need for, I think, a unified approach by CARICOM, because not this type of instability will impact not only Guyana, but the entire Caribbean community, CARICOM states. And we've seen, where some states of this, especially those of the smaller Eastern Caribbean countries, have in some ways been supportive of the Venezuelan position based on their national interest. Some are members of the ALBA, right? The alternative for, as they call it, the Alternativo Latin America for the Americas, which was started by Chavez. And the countries have benefited from Petro-Caribbean, so that there are some natural interests which are being exercised. And so that adds to the type of fragmentation which we see present in the region. And so that I think CARICOM needs to come up with a very unified approach, which will enable us to ensure stability in our region.
Thank you very much for this perspective on the Caribbean. I think that we have some problems with connection with Phil Ganson. So my next question would go to Victor Mijares. I think that's an opportunity for you to add your comment on Guyana you mentioned before, but also I would like you to develop a little bit about the balance of hitherto international initiatives to try to restore democracy and freedoms in Venezuela, and how do you assess the situation of the visible change of the approach of the United States? We would switch to Victor now. Okay. Oh, I'm happy to see Phil because I didn't know he was on. But okay, Victor, go ahead, and we'll go back to Phil for the comments on international allies for Maduro.
Great. Yeah, about Guyana, I will say only that, as my colleague from Guyana said, there is a important threat on the territorial integrity of the country. This is part of the this instability exportation from Venezuela, but also we are seeing some threats from a transnational way, as terrorist attack in Guyana, drug trafficking, even more and more important drug trafficking, especially after this Southern Spear operation in the Caribbean. Now we are looking for new and reinforced other routes to Africa, to Europe, also North America, of course, but especially to Africa and Europe. And I think this is important to understand that in the case of Guyana, there is an important mythology around the Essequibo in the case of Venezuela. As a Venezuelan, I was raised thinking about the Essequibo is part of Venezuela. It was stolen by the British, and Guyana has no rights on that territory. So this is an important issue, considering that the mindset of most Venezuelans is actually programmed to think that way. So I think this is a major issue, considering not only Maduro's regime, but also the position. This is an important issue we need to fix, in the future, considering that I think both countries needs to go to negotiate about this, dialogue about this, because now we understand that Guyana needs actually and has the right of development. So I think this is an important issue. But with this current situation of the Maduro regime and this phase of the hyper corruption of the Maduro regime and this aggressivity of the regime, it will be not possible to reach any kind of logical agreement, because now we are not looking at the logical political agreements and logical political decision making in Caracas right now. Considering the balance of diplomatic efforts in the region, regarding Venezuela, in terms of regional diplomacy, especially after the events of July 28 and 29, 29 was pretty violent in 2024, and the repression that followed, it initially seems that Colombia and Brazil were expected to assume a much more active role in defending democracy, actually. However, as days and weeks passed, it became evident that the government of Gustavo Petro and Luis Ignacio Lula da Silva were more interested in maintaining authoritarian stability in the region. Their priority appeared to be avoiding any scenario that could give political ammunition to the right wing, either in their own countries or across Latin America. The opposite, in the field of the left-wing president, the opposite was true in the case of Chile's president Gabriel Boric. He took a much more vocal instance in condemning what had happened. However, Chile has a very limited influence in the political and strategic affairs in northern South America and the Caribbean Basin. And precisely because of this limited weight of Chile, Boric could afford to speak out strongly without facing significant diplomatic consequences or altering the dynamics on the ground. In the case of the European Union, I think Spain's role under the government of Pedro Sanchez reduced the chances of a more constructive European position. That's my position, by the way. The Spanish socialist government maintains close ties with important elements of Chavismo, and former President José Luis Rodríguez Zapatero also has a long-standing connection with the ruling Venezuelan elite. So this relationship has shaped the European Union posture, making it more cautious and less consistent with the goal of pressuring the regime. And we'll stop here. I don't want to take more time because I really want to hear Phil.
Okay, so with Essequibo, that's also my impression that we shouldn't see this claim as something that is related to Maduro only, because the opposition shares the same ambition to recover Essequibo, which there is historical base arguments that make that. So even if there is democratic change, that doesn't mean that Venezuela stops to claim that part of the land. But I wanted to go back to Phil, but Victor mentioned the European Union, and I know that Stefania read the declaration from the last summit between European Union and CELAC, which was in the beginning of November in Santa Marta, Colombia. So how do you read that in much part of this document, there are a lot of references to international law, and including the mentions related to the fight against drug trafficking. So how do you read that and the perspective from the European Union?
So maybe I will start from zooming out a little bit and just say that EU is between the rock and the hard place in this particular situation, because on the one hand we have its ally, the US, and on the other hand we have the regime. So here it's on one hand we have a CELAC declaration which very openly underlines the principle of international law, of UN Charter, of non-intervention and fighting terrorism. But on the other hand, we have the ally that actually is reversing the table of international law, to say the least. And I believe that what we can see in the declaration is the maximum of diplomatic EU efforts that we'll see. So I wouldn't expect any further actions, but how I read the declaration is on one hand sending a signal to the region, on the other hand to the allies. We also need to remember that Venezuela withdrew from the declaration, so it's not a party to the final statement because it's a double-edged sword. And what I would expect from the EU is the continuation of this line, so again repeating the same statements, but also maybe some indications for the support of international justice system, because there are cases in ICC, in ICJ. So probably EU indirect support to those systems, together with perhaps some attempts to approach the US unofficially, indirectly, but the declaration as such is just summarizing the state of play, and if we want to go forward, it's rather unofficially.
Okay, thank you, Stefania. I would like to go back, Phil, again with that question on the current importance of cooperation, international cooperation between Maduro regime and his allies in Iran, Russia, China. But let me just move to the audience and just to repeat my proposal at the beginning, that you think about questions and comments. So I will give some time to our panelists to talk about this context of the US pressure, but please think about your questions, comments, be ready, and we'll go back to you and give you time for to participate in the discussion. So Phil, please let us present a little bit how it looks like with those most important international allies for the regime.
Yes, well, I suppose the first thing to say is that nobody is going to come to the aid of Maduro military attack. At least, there's no prospect of Russian or Chinese or Iranian troops landing in Venezuela to resist US intervention. Certainly, it's important for Maduro to have important allies like Russia and China, not least in the sense that, of course, they're both permanent members of the UN Security Council, which has meant that the Security Council and the UN political has been rather rooted in this whole situation. It's very difficult to take any positive role, any useful role in terms of trying to resolve the situation. Both Russia and Iran and also Cuba, nearer to home, have their own very serious problems to deal with. And I think that if the US were to move from Iran's primarily rhetorical stance at the moment towards some kind of overt intervention, just bombing, we would certainly see strongly worded communiques from Moscow and Havana and Tehran and Beijing, for that matter. But that would be about it. These, of course, are in a much more powerful, superpower. If they wanted to do something, they probably could. But the Chinese, I think, are unwilling even to help Maduro out in terms of hard cash. The Venezuelan government sends high-level delegations to Beijing fairly frequently to ask for more money, and of course the Chinese smile politely and say, you're a great ally, but of course behind the scenes they're saying, yes, but you owe us whatever it is, $18 billion that you not only have stopped paying, but you're not even attempting to restructure. So the Chinese are not going to be much help as well. The Venezuelans have a lot of Russian and Chinese supplied and Iranian supplied, actually, military equipment, some of which may come in very useful if the US does attempt to send over some bombs and rockets. I mean, particularly we're talking about radar, air defense systems and so on. But overall, Venezuela is not, it's extremely isolated within the region, as I started to say. And it seems to be becoming more isolated. Just in the last week or so, it's lost allies. It's lost the government in St. Vincent, the Grenadines, which has been a very reliable ally. It's best ally probably in the Caribbean, apart from Cuba. And it now appears to be losing another left-wing ally, Honduras. There's no love for Maduro in the region beyond one or two regimes that still cling to the idea that this is some kind of revolutionary progressive government. Cubans and the Nicaraguans, of course, first and foremost among them. So I think, in a sense, the United States, and we're going to come on to that, I know, in a minute, but the US, in attacking Maduro, is choosing a soft target, in the sense that although there is discomfort in the region, some countries are a bit more vocal than others in rejecting the US military deployment, eventually nobody is the aid of Maduro. He's someone that the region, regardless of their political position vis-a-vis the United States, would like to see the backlog. But of course, some of those governments feel the need to be at least polite to Donald Trump and to pay lip service to this idea that Maduro is heading some kind of narco-terrorist cartel, which in private I'm sure they're pretty convinced is not the case. But I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Phil. But I think that we can move to the very topic of our discussion, the context of the U.S. pressure. So let me move to Victor, because I know that you follow that. You also issue cyclical notes about the situation, about scenarios. So how would you describe the current situation? So how do you assess the motivations, goals of the Trump administrations now regarding Maduro, regarding what has been said to date and what has been done to date with the equipment, with all these decisions?
Well, thank you. first, I think that the U.S. is now, this year changing its position to a new strategy, not only in Latin America and the Caribbean, but around the world. And I think this is part of the, incoming national defense strategy and the national security strategy. So, but I think this change in the case of the Caribbean Basin and in the case of Venezuela has been shaped by two factors. One structural factor and one personal factor. Maybe some others, of course, but I will talk only about these two factors. The structural factor is that the United States is once again redirecting its attention towards its own hemisphere. National security, of course, homeland security, and Western Hemisphere. This is completely logical, since a great power cannot project influence globally if it does not first secure and dominate its immediate region. So this is a fundamental principle of major power strategy, as offensive realism emphasized, for instance. So from this perspective, Washington seems to accept that the international order is moving back to spheres of influence. In that context, the Western Hemisphere, and especially the Caribbean Basin, becomes vital to the U.S. national security objectives. Control and stability in this area, this is a turbulent area, of course, give the United States the freedom of action it needs in Europe and in the Pacific, for instance, and some other strategic theaters, as in the future in the Arctic, for instance. But the position right now is try to secure the area, even though they don't toppling Maduro, because I think this is not a strategic objective for Washington right now. Could be, an interesting objective for part of the government, part of the administration. High charges there, but it's not a strategic objective right now. And I think this is a tactical objective that is related to the second factor, that is more personal and relates directly to the current Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, Marco Rubio. Rubio, as you know, is a Cuban-American firmly anti-Castro, and he serves as a major bridge between the MAGA political project and the Hispanic elites in Florida. His worldview and political instinct carry considerable weight inside the administration, being a man that is right now not only, as I say, the Secretary of State, but also at the same time the National Security Advisor. This is not common. This is very, very, very rare in the history of U.S. foreign policy. So beyond that, I think there is another important element to consider, that is the ideological preference of the Trump inner circle, especially the foreign policy hawks like Rubio, of course, but also Big Texas, the Secretary of War. So they appear very willing to apply their core principle of peace through strength, meaning robust display of power, decisive action, and their readiness to confront hostile regime. But also, this is important because Phil said something that I think this is clear and key. That is, this is a soft target, so they can actually show power and make some kind of a statement, political and military statement, trying to change the situation in Venezuela. And I think this is the current mindset that is actually significantly shapes the current U.S. posture toward Venezuela and the broader Caribbean region.
Thank you very much, Victor. That was really insightful to show it in short points. I would like to move to Professor Carton to ask for his insight, for his interpretation of what United States does, and what are expectations, what are the concerns that are shared among Guyanese politicians, Guyanese experts.
To my Colombian colleague's statement about Guyana and Venezuela engaging in some levels of dialogue. And to let the audience know that since the 1960s, there have been several efforts at dialogue, reasoned dialogue, and seeking some agreements on the spurious claims of Venezuela. We've seen from the 1970s the good office process of the United Nations Secretary General being part of that dialogue in the midst of significant aggression by the government of Venezuela. And so by 2017, when the government of Guyana, recognizing that the futility of dialogue, approached the United Nations Secretary General under one of the elements of the Geneva Agreement of 1966 to use a process which he deemed important and necessary. And the Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon at the time, moved to the International Court of Justice as the final arbiter in this agreement, in this process. So here we see years of dialogue, and therefore, to my mind, in my view, the only element left is the adjudication of the International Court of Justice. And therefore, while we see, a mindset among our brothers and sisters in Venezuela, regardless of political persuasion, that Escobar belongs to them, we see where since 1899, a full and final and perfect agreement on the demarcation of boundaries being agreed upon until 1960s, when Venezuela, responding to a letter posthumously written by one of its, posthumously opened by one of its lawyers, suggesting there was some collusion that denied them a part of Guyana's territory. And we see where every effort made at adjudicating that process outside of the United Nations system was followed. So here we have in 2025 adjudication process being administered by the International Court of Justice. And in my view, only place that Venezuela should go is to the ICJ and continue to be part of that process, so that at the end of it, whatever the result is, there will be compliance with that judgment. In addition to that, now we talk about what are some of the issues here currently. Most of the Caribbean would agree that there's a level of unilateralism which has been exhibited by the overreach of the Trump administration in the region, based on their view that they're going behind drug trafficking and killing people in international water, where even the United Nations is saying that these are acts of extrajudicial execution. Most of the Caribbean is concerned, indeed, about that type of intervention and overreach. And while recognizing that the Maduro administration is surely engaging in human rights violations internally, and also, forcing large numbers of irregular migrants to the region, the issue of the principles of international law, for many of my colleagues in Guyana, must be adhered to. And so, indeed, we also see this movement to ensure that the sphere of influence, which was normally the US position in the hemisphere, is now being recreated or re-engineered. One has to take it into consideration that the geopolitical environment in the hemisphere is changing. And therefore, I think the unipolarity is no longer seen as, among some of the people in the region, as the way forward. and that the recognition of the view that there are other players, other actors, which when the US turns back away from the region, intervene and are there, present, both in terms of economic and investment engagement in the small states. I think those also have to be considered, so that when one looks at power and the maintenance of power by the United States, I think the issue of a multipolar environment is also considered.
Thank you very much, Professor Curtin, for that comments on Guyana, on the Guyana position on Essequibo, but also those comments about the Caribbean and the danger of unilateralism. I would like to go to pass the floor to Stefania now, because I think it's one of the valid questions here in Poland, as a member of European Union, is also the question: what leverage the European Union has in such a complex situation, because there's the additional dilemma to the one you mentioned about close relations with the United States and the adherence to international law in relations with CELAC countries. There is a dilemma that we have a Venezuela with a more increasingly repressive regime, and we have actions that already were named as extrajudicial killings, clear violation of international law by the United States. What leverage, what ways you see from the European Union in this case?
So first and foremost, it's increasing the sanctions, but that's the leeway is narrowing down, because it always takes 27 decisions for imposing the sanction. You need to also indicate particular people from the regime justifies those sanctions. So that's one of the actions, and it's already in place. So it's actually adding to the list and also prolonging those sanctions, as the current package would expire in January. And as far as the EU is concerned, I guess it's the most powerful tool it may implement in this case. Then, of course, there is some diplomatic pressure, unofficial one, discussions, persuasion, but here it's very difficult to see how it works in practice and to see the outcomes if the partner is totally unwilling to have this dialogue or to rethink the position or to change the behavior. It's not much to be done. But also there are some indirect actions that you may take. So it's the one I already mentioned. So it's support for the actors that are already dealing with the issues submitted to them. So international system of justice, UN agendas. So there is also, I would say it's not only about having this negative pressure on the regime, but also to have some positive actions, such as supporting Venezuelan society. So it's about boosting humanitarian assistance. It's support also for civil society organizations that may be channeled indirectly through partners on the ground, through the UN, for example. And I think that in the short term, that's what's the most realistic to be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. I'd like to react to those views about different actors, about their perception on the U.S. policy. And I would like to ask you how you see the reaction expectations of the solution, because we have a list of the various attempts of negotiations trying to press using sanctions without any effect. And we have a big challenge of accountability of the regime, because there is international criminal court, there is bounty United States on Maduro. So how do you see this expectations maybe in Venezuela? What would be the solution, and in what part this final solution as military intervention brings the acceptance from Venezuelans now?
Yes, well, I suppose I'd start by saying that in International Crisis Group, we don't believe that unilateral military action or the threat of unilateral military action by the United States is going to produce a solution. The solution that we're looking for, the solution that we feel would be most beneficial to Venezuelans, which of course is the main issue here, is if a gradual, peaceful, democratic transition could be achieved. Now, that obviously is the ideal, and it's extremely difficult to achieve in practice. As you said, there have been many attempts to negotiate that. The government of Nicolás Maduro has a long record of not abiding by commitments that it makes at the negotiating table. Nonetheless, I think it's worth pointing out that over the last 25, 26 years that the Chavista regime under first Hugo Chavez and now Nicolás Maduro has been in power, the most successful initiatives tended to be those that focused on dialogue, on political participation, on nationally based solutions, rather than, for example, electoral boycotts, mass mobilization, or coups d'etat, or foreign intervention. I think every time that the Venezuelan opposition has tried to achieve something via some kind of shortcut, it's proven to be a dead end. And in fact, in most cases, has resulted in setbacks for the opposition and for the cause of democracy. Now, of course, a lot of people say, and it's entirely understandable, we've had so many rounds of negotiation, the government is not going to leave power peacefully, there's really no point, and some form of military action is required. Maria Corina Machado would say that there's no need for US military intervention because ultimately within the Venezuelan armed forces there is so much dissent, so much discontent with the government of Maduro that in effect if they're given enough encouragement, then the Venezuelan armed forces themselves will do the job. I don't think that's really very realistic either for a number of reasons that we might perhaps go into, but perhaps in the question and answer session. But I think it's important to note that the situation, even the advances that were made over the last couple of years, and there have been advances. I mean, the opposition did win an election, even though it wasn't free and fair. They demonstrated that they won an election. Maria Corina Machado's leadership itself emerged from the process of the Barbados Accords at the end of 2023, because otherwise there wouldn't have been an opposition primary and she wouldn't have won by the landslide that she did. The fact that we have a president-elect in the form of Edmundo Gonzalez, even though he's in exile, is also a product of negotiation. Now, how do you go back to that? I think the political conditions right now are not suitable unless the US administration under Donald Trump were to decide that it's going to put all this tremendous effort, this tremendous build-up of military pressure to good use and persuade Maduro to go back to the negotiating table with the opposition and negotiate a gradual political transition. They're not going to leave immediately. Maduro is not going to leave the country. It's very difficult for me to imagine that the military is going to overthrow him. But I think unless the US is prepared to go back to the idea that this has to be done in conjunction with a Venezuelan opposition presence at the negotiating table, then it's very hard to see a solution. Unfortunately, I think the US has painted itself into a corner, as we say in English, in the sense that it's hard to imagine that Donald Trump can simply say, "Oh well, we didn't achieve what we came for. We'll the fleet can sail away." We somehow have to come away with some kind of victory speech, if you like. There has to be a moment where they can say, "Mission accomplished." Maybe it has to do with drugs. Maybe they can say, "Well, we've dealt with the problem of drugs in the Southern Caribbean. We can turn our attention elsewhere." Perhaps they feel that they're going to have to blow something up here first. It's a pity that it's been done in this way, but now we're at this juncture. The danger, I think, is that it could end up strengthened, because if the US ultimately has to concede that it's not going to be able to overthrow him, then of course he has what I like to call his Bay of Pigs moment. This moment at which he can say, "Well, I stood up to the US empire," as they like to call it, and they were forced to back down. So rather than weakening him, much less overthrowing him, they could end up strengthening Maduro, at least for a while, internally. His personal position would be strengthened because he'd be able to say, "I'm the leader that got us through this."
Thank you, Phil. That was not a very optimistic scenario, but I think it's a good base to think about the possible outcomes. That will be our last part of the discussion. But I would like to turn to our audience and to ask if you have any questions. I know that there is one question. Please use micro and please introduce yourself.
I hope you can hear me. Hello, Paul Bulawajda, the Polish Institute of International Affairs. First of all, it's a pleasure, and thank you so much for this panel today. I have two open questions, really. First one, as we have discussed, whether it is a big stick policy 2.0 or a big bluff policy that we're witnessing from the US. It's certainly true that the stance towards the Western Hemisphere has become more hawkish, as Professor Michares has noted. My question would be, in your opinion, what's the regional outlook, let's say, or the strategy regarding this hawkish America first, European foreign policy? We're slowly coming to an end of this first year. There are 3 more years ahead with this administration. This administration has used this narrative of drug trafficking, fentanyl, to push for harder economic measures, harder deals with the region. So how can these countries kind of hedge against it? And my second question would be, in the rather unlikely scenario, but still, if the US authorizes limited strikes on Venezuela, how would the region react? And what would be the political, humanitarian, and international law implications? Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Is there any more question from the audience? Okay. Okay. Ambassador Spyra.
Okay, sorry, it's very modern to me. Jarosław Spyra from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I have heard with interest the discussion about the question of Venezuela, and I have heard also well, I believe that in this moment in the question of Venezuela, we have a clash between two orders, the former order and the new order of the world. The former order is, of course, sanctions, of course, democracy, of course, international organizations. And the new order that we are presenting in this moment is the force represented by the carrier, Gerald Ford. And in this moment, of course, we have also the question of the narco-traffic is a secondary question from the point of view of the United States, because the prime goal of the policy of the United States in this moment, I believe, is to kick up from Venezuela the influence of Russia and China. And I believe this will be a consistent policy to Latin America, because American first, it's also to guarantee the interests of the United States, not to have a concurrence from Russia and not to have a concurrence from China. And of course, like Professor said, Trump must win, because if he don't win, he is losing his face towards Latin America. So one way or another, he has to have a success. I believe that the intervention of the United States could produce the fall of Maduro, could produce a second Syria solution that Maduro and his family and maybe of some kind of his close persons will spend the last some years in Russia. But also the intervention of the United States will be a strong kick to the authority of Russia and to authority of China, because in the second time, Russia will abandon our ally, not in Syria, not in this moment, not in the Middle East, but in Latin America. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Spira. Last question, Patrick Kugier.
Hello, thank you very much. I have a very quick question regarding this maximum pressure exercised by the United States, because in the media we can hear recently that the only thing that Maduro is negotiating now with US is the terms of its exit, escape from the country. How do you assess this? How likely it is that Maduro will step down under the US pressure and will leave the country, opening the way for political negotiations?
Thank you. That was Patrick Kugier, our PISM analyst for India, South Asia. We have little time left, so let me ask you, all panelists, to react to those questions as you wish. But my question would be that you share your short view of the potential scenarios for Venezuela and the region, or the regions you deal with or you represent. So maybe let me start from Professor Curtin first. So reaction to the questions and your expectations of the scenarios. Just let me remind the questions. One, if there is a big stick, number 2.0 or big bluff, and regional outlook. Second question, what will be reaction to limited strikes if they happen? And finally, we have the questions of Ambassador Spira about two orders, the new one of using the force, and Patrick Kugiel about the potential escape of Maduro and his cronies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In relation to Guyana and the Caribbean, in my view, it's a very complex scenario which is unfolding. We've seen where unilateralism has resulted in the presence of the largest aircraft carrier and 11 other warships in our region, which has brought some levels of concern, serious levels of concern about this impact, negative impact on the Caribbean, should there be any strike. So, in a sense, some people suggest that overreach, military overreach, is the use of the big stick policy by the US in an attempt to regain its sphere of influence. And that could bring some concerns, more grave concerns, and perhaps impact in the region. For example, we've just seen where Venezuelan airspace has been deemed closed by the US administration. And that has brought additional level of concern about air safety in the region and movement among peoples in the region. Some argue that it may eventually become the closure of maritime space, which would impact tourism in the region, trade, and the movement of people and goods, which would cause shortages and increase challenges for small states in the region. So we have those concerns as this complexity increases. In relation to a democratic transition, one would hope that that there is that kind of movement that will limit loss of life, and also the question of movement of migrants. Iran is concerned, for example, and as a region, about a new wave of migrants. Could there be any attack or any strike, any air strike Israel? And it's a purpose and an effort which will have which is the region. That's a situation we're in, and we will look at the regional approach. My view is that Caribbean, there's a large connect in the United States. I think if you say our strongest partner and trading partner, and therefore I think we have to approach this and ensure that that which is unified in terms of curriculum, right? Ensure are negative to the entire region.
Thank you very much. Now, Phil Ganson, please share your final reflections and, as you wish, react to the questions from the audience.
The question as to whether Maduro is going to step down. I believe actually that this whole approach, this maximum pressure 2, as you might say, after the maximum pressure 1 under Trump in 2019, 2020, this whole thing has been from the beginning a bluff. The idea has been not to use US forces in reality more than for blowing up a few boats in the Caribbean, but to persuade the Venezuelan military to do the job for them. I think that, as I may have said before, was based on false premises. I don't think Maduro is going to leave unless something extraordinary happens, because he's much safer in Venezuela than he is outside, potentially even in Russia. So I think it's a bluff, and I think Maduro is reading it as a bluff. And I think we have to be very careful in our reading of media coverage, especially out of the United States, because there's a lot of intentional leaking going on, to give the impression that there's a much harder line being taken. I think the coverage, for example, of the conversation the other day between Trump and Maduro gives the impression that Maduro was issued an ultimatum, and I think it's much more nuanced than that. I think talks are continuing. And just the last point I would say, I think if the world, as Victor said earlier, is to some extent returning to an era of spheres of influence, it's logical to assume that Venezuela will ultimately return to the Western Hemisphere, to return to the US sphere of influence. That's logical. And, it may be that we have to pay attention to even things as far away as the Russia-Ukraine war, in the sense that the connection between the two, obviously, is the relationship between Putin and Trump. Is there some deal between Putin and Trump whereby Putin wouldn't mind such giving up Venezuela, provided that he gets to keep eastern Ukraine? I think the world, as the gentleman from the Polish Foreign Ministry said, is changing. The old rules have been thrown out of the window to a large extent. And we're still working out what's going to happen in this new and rather unpredictable world. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Last words from Victor.
wonderful event and this, such an interesting question. I really love this. I don't remember the name, but the ambassador says something about the former normative order and the new force order, and this idea that Trump actually must win. I think this is absolutely right. This is the real situation we are living and witnessing here. Is this breaking order of based on law, based on human rights, based on some kind of international law regime, and now we are moving to a new force order. And I think actually Trump must win, and I agree with Phil about this. He needs at least the victory speech, the victory discourse to say, okay, mission accomplished. But I think this is not that easy for the people around Trump, especially Marco Rubio. I will insist on Rubio because I think he's the main piece in this operation, because Rubio need actually not only to win, need to be credible. This winning, this victory should be credible, and he is building a political platform for presidency. So, and Latin America is very important here. Now, about this condition of big stick policy and big stick bluff, I love it. I think that any realistic strategy must start with the basic fact. The Chavista regime cannot be influenced through diplomacy, or it is a criminal survival structure that cannot assess credible threat or risk without putting its leader lives at risk. So for this reason, political pressure without a credible backing of force is effective. So in this condition, this current condition, if they thought that it will be enough with a bluff, they are committing the same mistake that they commit with John Bolton years ago. This ultimatum and this threat, because the Chavistas, and especially the civil military parapolice and criminal structure is not prepared to surrender. They cannot surrender. They must, by design, the Chavismo only can go on. So if they are not prepared to use force, so this could be a major mistake, and this could actually mark the rest of the Trump administration. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Victor. And let me pass the floor for the last comments from Stefania before we close our event. Sorry that we were a little bit after time, but I hope that you are enjoying this discussion, because there are a lot of thoughts that maybe are not so obvious in the media. So, Stefania, please.
Okay, thank you. So I will be super brief. So you asked about the scenarios for the region. So let's take the EU perspective. So whereas it's certainly not the most important actor in this setting, the situation also has its implications to the EU, because the EU is kind of point of reference. So we watch how, if, when, and how it would react to the ongoing situation, violations or potential violations of international law. So the EU needs to be very cautious about its both actions and inactions, and weigh the cost of doing nothing or making another statements or trying to get involved. And all those assessments may fuel the accusation of double standards, may weaken its case in other parts of the globe when it advocates for the values and for some further actions. So I think it's also kind of showcase of EU involvement, even if in remote parts of the globe. But it's always about maintaining its values and being kind of, as I said, point of reference. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefania. Just a short wrap up. I think it's important to remember what Victor said. Venezuela is a great challenge of instability exportation, that it's exporting that to the region. Maduro is soft target for United States, so it's quite easy and to show this new approach, new order, new force order. As we heard, we need to evaluate cost of doing nothing, because here it's not free. There is a big challenge related to the international context of the fragmentation in the region. The fragmentation, for example, in the Caribbean region, as Professor Curtin pointed out. In the EU, there is this dilemma that for you, United States is a really important partner, but at the same time, European Union wants to develop relations based on the principles of international law with such countries as Latin American and Caribbean states. We face recreation of the spheres of influence, also the sphere of influence, the danger of unilaterality. And in case of Venezuela, as Phil mentioned, the best solution is about political participation, not boycotts. And here there is importance of the understanding or engagement of the United States with the opposition, that there's a cooperation and Venezuelan solution for the great challenge that is facing that country. So hopefully we'll see some positive dynamic despite this quite pessimistic scenario now, and hopefully could go back to the similar discussion in close future. I really thank our speakers, those who are online, Stefania. I appreciate the audience who was with us, and I really hope that you enjoyed. And we invite you to the other events, not only about Latin America. So let me join with applauding our panelists and thanking them for their contributions. Thank you very much.